Welcome to Social Psychology, unit on stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So stereotypes and prejudice, this is going to be sort of an extension on what we talked about when we talked about person perception. We're perceiving individuals, but we're perceiving individuals as a function of their group membership. And that group membership has with it a set of prepackaged expectations and impressions that we use to guide or influence how we perceive people that we're working with, or talking to, behaving with. Remember, perception is going to be based on somewhat on these expectations. Recall that last time we talked about the expectations that we have can influence people's behavior in some pretty profound ways. And these same expectations play a role in stereotypes and prejudice. There's a couple of things we'll talk about, some important distinctions. Oftentimes people use the phrases stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, racism, sort of interchangeably. But there's some important distinctions that we make in the literature in order to talk about these constructs. So stereotypes are beliefs about groups. You can also think of these as expectations. So Muslims are terrorists, Asians are good at math, gays are promiscuous, black people are less intelligent, whatever. These are beliefs about groups. Prejudice then is feelings towards particular groups. I don't like Muslims. I don't like Asians. Not necessarily, these things don't necessarily have to be negative though. Like maybe you are very into Asians and you really like Asians because they're Asian, right? Again, that would be a form of prejudice. We'll talk about this later on when we talk about this idea of the halo effect. That if someone has qualities that are associated with good, that association with the idea of good extends to other aspects of that person. Discrimination then is a combination of prejudice and behavior, right? So stereotypes are beliefs, prejudice are feelings about groups, and discrimination are behaviors. So this could be making derogatory comments in the comment section on YouTube, or, for example, getting a pass because you're white. I used to teach at Chicago State University, a prominently black school, and I would always tell this story about being pulled over once by a black police officer when I didn't have my license. I had lost it and I just hadn't gotten it replaced yet. And the officer told me that driving without a license, and I had my kids in the car, that he was supposed to take me back to the station, take custody of my kids, and run all of my information and arrest me for driving without a license. But what happened? He ran my information, and once he found out I was a college professor, he let me go and told me to go get my license. That is an example of what we'll talk about later as white privilege, right? Getting a pass. I used to tell my students at Chicago State, my predominantly African American students, that I am fully convinced and aware that if I had been black in that situation, I don't think I would have gotten that pass. I don't think I would have gotten that treatment. So discrimination doesn't necessarily have to be negative, right? We can discriminate in ways that benefit others as well. So in terms of psychology, we'll talk about affect, behavior, and cognition. So prejudice is the affect, it's the feeling component. Behavior is discrimination, and cognition, stereotyping, is the cognitive component. Now, we can have prejudice against, prejudice exists all around the world. We can have prejudice against all different kinds of groups. Basically, anything we can use to categorize people, we can be prejudiced based on. So race, ethnicity, religion, gender, class, handicap, age, weight, socioeconomic status, or whether you're poor or whether you're wealthy. People will even engage in prejudice in what we call minimal groups. So these are groups that have just the most minimal amount of grouping information. So I could flip a coin and say, You people on the left side of the room, you're in group A, and you people on the right side of the room, you're in group B. And just by flipping the coin and creating those minimal groups, there are certain circumstances where I can get group A to behave prejudiced towards group B and vice versa. Now, when we talk about racism, we're talking about prejudice and discrimination that's specifically based on racial background, sexism specifically based on gender. This is found all over the world. Now, where does this come from? Well, it comes from categorization. One thing that is sort of fundamentally human is we categorize everything and we do it automatically. Our brains have mechanisms built in where we take stimuli from our environment and we automatically categorize those things, right? We do the same thing with people, right? We categorize people. So, for example, have you ever think about a time in your life where you had an experience where you saw someone and you weren't sure whether they were male or female? And what happens when you see someone when you're not sure if they're male or female? You focus on that person and you try to figure out what is going on. Who is that, a male or a female? Now, here's the thing. Why is it that everyone has that experience? Why is it that that happens? The reason why it happens is that our brains are automatically categorizing people that we come into. Male, female, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. Right? Poor, rich, whatever. Automatically doing this categorization. And when we can't sort out a category, when our brain can't do this for us automatically, it sends that you can call it like a hiccup. It sends that sort of like interrupted process up to consciousness and says, hey, consciousness, focus on this. We need to know, is this a male or a female? Okay. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, about this idea of sort of automatic versus controlled processes. We also divide people into in-groups and out-groups. People that are part of our group, people that are not part of our group. However we define our group. So it could be our social group, our racial group, our geographical group, our political group, whatever it is. We divide the world into in-groups and out-groups. And generally speaking, we exaggerate differences between our in-groups and our out-groups. Like we want to keep our groups distinct. And so in order to keep them distinct, we overestimate differences between the groups. If I ask you, think about, like, let's say you're a Democrat or let's say you're a Republican, and I say, think about the average Democrat or the average Republican, your average out-group political member, you're going to overestimate those differences between your group and the out-group. And you are going to believe that everyone in your group thinks the same way that you do. You're going to underrate differences within your group. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to treat our in-group better, right? You're going to be more favorable. You're going to treat your in-group more favorably, right? So if one of your very close friends asks a favor of you, you're going to be more likely to do that favor for them than if it's someone that you only kind of know at work, right? If your good friend asks you to help them move, you're going to be more likely to do that than the person who just happens to share the cubicle next to you at work. And so we talk about this as in-group favoritism. And we do this in this minimal groups paradigm. We even do this completely randomly, right? If I create two groups completely randomly, I say, you're in group A, the other people are in group B, and I say, you can distribute this money however you want, give as much of it to your group or as much of it to the other group as possible. People will always, well, always is a strong word, people will more often than not show in-group favoritism even when groups are random. You're going to be more likely to distribute resources to your in-group rather than an out-group, even when that out-group is completely random. Now, we can have prejudice and discrimination based on these minimal categories, but we also generate stereotypes based on this idea of illusory correlation, which is the tendency to overestimate the frequency of distinct or rare events, right? So essentially what happens is when we have very rare events and they co-occur together, that gives us the false impression that they must correlate, right? So for example, a terrorist attack is a relatively rare thing. If you look on the causes of death for people in the United States list, being killed by a terrorist is probably, as rare as like falling off of a building and getting shot at the same time. Like it's relatively an extremely rare cause of death. And in the United States, Muslims are a minority group. So they represent, again, a relatively rare group of people in the United States, especially Orthodox fundamentalist Muslims. So when we have one distinct event and a distinctive group, then we're going to be more likely to see those two things as related. But what about fundamentalist Christian, right? This also occurred. We also had Timothy McVeigh bombing the Oklahoma City building and killing a large number of people, granted not as many as 9/11, but Christians, fundamentalist Christians, white Christians, are much less distinctive group. So because the group is less distinctive, right, it is much easier for people to ignore the possibility of that illusory correlation, right? Terrorist event is distinctive. Muslims are distinctive. I don't know any Muslims, therefore all Muslims must be terrorists. But Christian commits an act of terror. Well, I know lots of white male Christians, and I know they're not terrorists, so I don't develop that illusory correlation, right? And this can lead to stereotyping. So if you take two rare events, for example, African Americans are rare in society compared to whites. This is 2010 data, but African Americans make up about 12% of the populations compared to whites 68 to 70%. Violence is also a rare thing in society, right? So in 2010, there were approximately 387 violent crimes per 100,000 people in the United States. So that's a lot. It's not a frequent occurrence. So blacks, rare people, especially if you live outside of major cities. Violence, a rare thing to happen. So even though whites are almost twice as likely to be arrested for violent crime, at 59% of arrests versus 38%, people still generate the illusory correlation that African Americans commit more violent crime. And there's lots of evidence that whites will overestimate the arrest rate of African Americans, right? So even though whites are twice as likely to be arrested for violent crime, we don't generate the stereotype that whites are violent. We generate the stereotype that the rare or distinctive group is violent. You can also think about this in terms of fundamental attribution error, right? When we see stereotype consistent behavior, when we see the black person, on the news being shown for being arrested for a violent crime, then we tend to make internal attributions for that behavior. We tend to make them, it sort of reinforces our belief that the outgroup is homogenous, that they're all basically the same. But what happens when we have inconsistent behavior, right? What happens, there's a stereotype that women are bad drivers, and yet Danica Patrick is a race car driver, and she does pretty good. I mean, I know nothing about, race car driving, but I assume she's a race car driver. People know who she is. She does pretty good, right? When we have behavior that's inconsistent with a stereotype, we tend to make situational attributions. When we see behavior that's inconsistent with a stereotype, we go, oh, well, he's one of the good ones. Or, oh, she's all women are bad drivers. Everybody knows that. But she's a good driver because she grew up around boys and her father taught her how to drive at a young age, blah, 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 blah. Right? And we talk about this as sort of subtypings, right? We strongly maintain our stereotypes. And rather than adjust those stereotypes, we will subtype and we'll create exceptions. Like, all black people are violent, but the very lovely, nice black person that I just met, they're just one of the good ones. They're a subtype. And you could sort of think about this in terms of the confirmation bias that we talked about last time, right? We look for information that confirms our expectations. And this is true for stereotypes. We seek out examples of other groups' behaviors that reinforce our existing stereotypes, and we discount, subtype, ignore the information that doesn't. The other thing too that can happen is we can think about this in terms of self-fulfilling prophecies. Stereotypes can lead people to behave in a way that elicit stereotype confirming behavior. So, for example, if you have a negative stereotype about, let's say, Korean shop owners, and you think Korean shop owners are racist, and Korean shop owners are rude, and you have these sort of stereotypes about Korean shop owners, and then you walk into a Korean shop, and your expectation of that behavior creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where your behavior leads them to behave in a way that is consistent with the stereotype that you have for them. Now, stereotype, we've been talking a lot about the effect of stereotypes on our perception of other people, but stereotypes can actually affect our own behavior as well, stereotypes about the groups that we belong to. So, for example, stereotype threat is the fear that you may confirm one of the stereotypes about your groups. So, for example, African Americans in intellectual performance, or women in math performance. There's a stereotype that women are bad at math. If you're put in a situation where you may confirm a stereotype about your group, you may actually end up confirming that stereotype. And so what Steele and Aronson did is they gave a bunch of black and white participants a very difficult verbal task, and then they were told, they manipulated the instructions that they gave them. They said, this is either diagnostic of intellectual ability, or this is just really about general problem solving skills. Right? Now, diagnostic of intellectual ability poses a stereotype threat for African Americans. Right? African Americans are well aware of the stereotypes about their group, one of which being they're less intelligent, and so being in a situation where they may confirm that stereotype poses this stereotype threat. And then they measured their performance on this task. And what they found was that for the white participants, obviously there was no effect of the stereotype threat instructions. And the African Americans in the general problem solving group did just as well as the whites on the task. It was only when the task was framed as being diagnostic of intelligence, when it created this potential for these African American participants to confirm this stereotype about their group, that they actually did worse. And so what they suggest is that this may be due to anxiety, right? So it creates this sort of fear that if you do badly on the test, you're going to confirm people's stereotype, but also because of this idea of mental resources. If you think about your brain as having sort of finite amount of resources, of capacity to problem solve and do all the things that your brain has to do. If you think about those as being finite, there's a limited amount, then being anxious or being nervous gobbles up some of those mental resources and leaves less resources to actually do well on the task. It sort of interferes with your ability to do well on the task. And this has been demonstrated through tons of variety of groups as a very robust effect, that when you're in a situation where you're presented with an opportunity to confirm a stereotype about your group, that that creates a stereotype threat which actually decreases your performance overall. The good news is this can be mitigated with training. Now, institutional prejudice is when we have racial discrimination, inequality that is occurring sort of in an organizational or institutional context. So you can think of this as sort of a macro level. This isn't, the Korean shop owner discriminating, following you around the store because you're black. This is, the disparities in public policy or in labor practices and these kinds of things. This kind of discrimination at the institutional level can be both overt and subtle, right? So we'll talk about this, but it kind of used to be that it was okay to discriminate against black people in the United States, and there were times when black people would simply not be offered housing, for example, in white neighborhoods, and there was sort of this, overt push for segregation. So it can be sort of distributing more resources to one group or another. It can also be just general rules or processes that favor certain groups. So, for example, the housing discrimination, which I just talked about, or sentencing guidelines for crack versus cocaine possession. Back in the 80s, during the war on drugs, the sentencing guidelines, I want to say, and I don't have these figures in front of me, but the sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine are about 18 times greater than possession of cocaine. And crack and cocaine are effectively the same narcotic drug. But the difference is, who are the people who are predominantly using crack? They tend to be poor and they tend to be black. And who are the people who are predominantly using cocaine? They tend to be middle class and they tend to be white, right? And so even though there might not be an intention there to discriminate, right, there still is discrimination in terms of the guidelines at this level of the institution, at this level of the overarching society. Now, one important component of this issue of institutional prejudice is that these sort of macro structural prejudice and discrimination, it doesn't necessarily require the intent of individuals, right? There doesn't necessarily have to be an intention to discriminate for discrimination to still happen. We talk about this in terms of disparate impact, that the effects of a policy may impact a group differentially. So, for example, in some states, there are arguments against voter ID laws on this disparate impact bounds, that while there's no intent to discriminate in the law, that the effect of the law does end up discriminating against people who are older and people who are poorer in terms of their ability to vote. There's substantial evidence of institutional prejudice in the United States, comparing whites to non-whites. So non-whites earn significantly less. Women earn significantly less than men. Non-whites earn significantly less than whites. Non-whites have shorter lifespans. So people who are white tend to live longer on average compared to non-whites. Non-whites have less access to high-quality education, so there is some degree of segregation still in the schools in the United States. I mean, just take a look at the schools in Chicago as a perfect example of this. Poor black kids get a worse education than middle-class white kids across the board in the United States. And non-whites are more likely to be convicted of a crime. So remember earlier I showed you those numbers on the arrest rates, and I said whites are significantly more likely to be arrested compared to non-whites because we represent a larger proportion of the population. Well, when you look further on down the line at that, though, non-whites are significantly more likely to be convicted. So even though they're arrested at lower rates, they're convicted at greater rates than whites. And when they are convicted, they tend to get a longer jail sentence. And we'll talk even more about some of the details of this later on. And I'm giving you all the links here because I want you to be able to investigate these claims for yourself. I know that for some it may be controversial for me to say that prejudice does still exist at the level of the institution in the United States. So you can look at these studies on your own. So when we talk about this, then it comes to this question of, okay, well, what is white privilege then, right? People talk, especially in this day and age, about this idea of white privilege. And in terms of the literature, when we talk about white privilege as researchers, we're talking about the fact that whites have statistically better life outcomes on average than if they had been born of a different race. Now, you might say to yourself in response to that, but how can I be privileged if my life sucks? Right? I can't tell you the number of times I have seen this meme on the internet. I'm a straight white male and I was told there would be privilege. Like, how can I have white privilege if I'm having hardships? Right? And the thing is that everyone suffers hardships. But these sort of non-racial hardships are irrelevant to this racial privilege that is enjoyed by whites in the United States, right? Privilege is not this sort of like ease or lack of hardship. It's it's a comparison to someone with equal hardships but a different race, right? For example, when a white person loses their job, they tend to, on average, get rehired at faster rates than this non-white person with similar background. There's evidence that having a white name can increase the rate at which you get called back by employers compared to people with a black name, right? So it's not this, white privilege is not this sort of like your life is easy and it's handed to you on a silver platter, right? It's more that, it's more of this sort of subtle benefit that is coming, relative to people with equivalent life and equivalent hardships. Going back to what I said before about getting the pass, like the white privilege for me is getting that pass from that police officer, getting let go when I'm driving without a license with 2 kids in the car. Like that is white privilege, because I know that one of my black female college professor colleagues, probably who's got the same education as me, who is effectively the same as me in many respects, probably would not have gotten the same treatment that I had gotten in that instance. Now you may be saying to yourself at this time, still, I have hardships, right? I have a tough life. I'm white, therefore privilege doesn't exist, right? And the reason why you feel that way is because when people are presented with evidence of white privilege, this sort of threatens their sense of self. It threatens your sort of sense of self-determination, right? This sort of American ideal that I'm an individual and I've earned everything that I've gotten, right? Being told or confronted with the fact that you do indeed experience white privilege in the United States threatens this sort of sense of self. And Phillips and Lowry did this great study where they actually showed that when we take participants and we present them with evidence of white privilege compared to nothing, those who read about privilege actually end up claiming that their life is harder than it is, right? Claiming that their life is harder than people in the control condition. And what's even more crazy about this study is that when those same people had a self-affirmation, when they wrote about all of their good qualities, why they're amazing, right? Reading about white privilege didn't threaten their sense of self because they had just affirmed it, and this reduced this effect. So at the end of the day here, one of the conclusions here is that for whites in the United States, denying that racial privilege extends to them allows them to protect their sense of self, while simultaneously saying, well, like, I know that it exists, but I don't get any privilege, right? It sort of allows to sort of protect the sense of self. Now, a lot of people would argue since the 1960s, prejudice has decreased in the United States. And the next thing we're going to talk about is, like, how has prejudice changed in the United States? For the discussion this week, I'm going to have you guys watch these videos here, and we'll talk about this in the discussion. Now, it used to be that prejudice was blatant. It used to be, so back in the 1960s, signs like these, whites only, Jews need not apply, that kind of thing. Holding these negative views towards groups was totally okay to just come out and say that. And, in many parts of the country, it is still kind of acceptable to be blatantly prejudiced or to be blatantly discriminatory. So, for example, I had a student at Chicago State University who told me, a black student, when she was driving through rural Missouri, she stopped at a gas station for gas, and the person came out and told her that there was no gas available and she had better move on, right? And that is discrimination, and this is still happening today, not 2 years ago. But prejudice has changed in the United States, right? and has changed from being this sort of like blatant prejudice to this more sort of modern or symbolic prejudice, right? So we discriminate, but we discriminate for non-prejudicial, non-stereotype-based reasons, right? I'm not racist, but I think that I think that black people should just dress better, right? Because then they'll get more respect in society, right? So it's not like I oppose President Obama because he's black. I just don't like him because he's a liberal, former President Obama, because he's a liberal or a socialist, right? I don't think Obama was the worst president in modern history because he's black. It has nothing to do with that, right? It's just because, of all of these policies that he's implemented that have ruined this country. Now, there's ways that we can measure these kinds of prejudice. So we can use explicit measures. So these are, paper and pencil questionnaires asking people these sorts of how do they, how much do you agree with the following statement? I don't like black people very much would be explicit. Or the more modern or symbolic prejudice would be like, I feel like how much you agree with the following statement? Over the past few years, blacks have gotten more than they deserve, right? That's sort of a symbolic prejudice kind of statement. Implicit prejudice, though, is when we are measuring the cognitive processing that people go through when they are thinking about groups, and it's a way of tapping into unconscious processes that may reflect some prejudice. So this old-fashioned prejudice is all about my group is better than your group, segregation is good. Symbolic prejudice is more, your group violates my values. Discrimination doesn't really exist and you're just asking for too much, right? So, this is sort of like the colorblind society, right? We elected a black president, therefore we're in a post-racial America where prejudice no longer exists, right? And that in and of itself is sort of this modern form of prejudice, denying that discrimination still goes on. Measures of implicit prejudice, though, are a way that we can sort of get around this problem of explicit measures. So, for example, everyone kind of knows, like even your racist Uncle Jay kind of knows that it's not okay to be prejudiced against black people, right? Racist Uncle Jay might tell terrible racist jokes at Thanksgiving, right? But racist Uncle Jay is probably not going to say those same jokes in the office because he knows it's just like not okay, right? Implicit measures of prejudice are a way that we can get around those conscious filters and we can get a sense of the kinds of associations people have. So we can measure your association with the word black or with the word white, and how strongly you associate that with good or bad. How strongly you associate the blackface, for example, with good or bad. Do you see the blackface? So I can have you see the blackface, and then I'll mask it, and then I ask you, is this a word or a non-word? Right? And if you strongly associate the word black with bad, then you're going to be faster to identify those bad words, hate, unpleasant, whatever, than you would these non-words or positive words. Right? You're going to be faster to react to stereotype consistent words. And again, the way this sort of works is I show this example. I show you a black face, and then I have you indicate on a keyboard whether it's a word or a non-word, and then the computer measures the reaction time that you have. How quickly do you identify the word hate as a word? How quickly do you identify the word happy as a word, or lazy, or these sort of stereotypical words? And what this tells us, or what this gives us, is a sense of how strongly these things are associated in your brain, right? If you see the word black, or you see the black face and you respond very fast to the word happy, right, then that shows you have a strong association with black and happy. Or if you see the black face and you're really fast to respond to the word lazy, then it shows that you have a strong association with that concept and that word, right? And this just measures strength of association. Again, this isn't necessarily prejudice or discrimination because it's happening at an unconscious level, but it tells us about the strength of these associations that you have. The implicit associations test is another example of this, where they can tell you about what your biases look like. How biased are you unconsciously towards obese people or poor people or black people? I strongly encourage you guys to go to the Project Implicit website here and take one of these tests for yourself. I have a feeling you will be surprised by the results. Now, people who unconsciously favor their group over others will take less time to associate the group with pleasant versus the outgroup with unpleasant, because this is the way these things are set up in our brains. And what's interesting about this is that these implicit prejudice, they persist over time. So for explicit measures of prejudice, like kids usually, they don't really haven't figured out social rules yet. Like they don't know that it's not okay to be prejudiced, most kids. And so, and this is from a while ago too, but what they find is that kids figure out pretty quickly that it is not okay to be explicitly prejudiced, and the amount of people reporting explicit prejudice decreases as they get older. But these implicit associations, right? How strongly we associate black with bad and white with good, those associations persist at an unconscious level as age goes on, right? So there's no effective age on these unconscious associations, which suggests that we just get better at masking our negative associations as we get older, while we still hold these negative associations. Now, where do these come from? They come from the media. They come from the experiences that we have in our day-to-day life. They come from our parents, from the people that we interact with, right? We learn prejudice and discrimination. We learn stereotypes about women. For example, there was a Barbie that came out back in the mid-90s, and it was one of those pull-string Barbies. And of the many phrases that the Barbie said, one of them was, math is hard, right? Which is a negative stereotype about women, right? So you can imagine little girls, with this image of a woman, and the woman is saying math is hard, right? This perpetuates these stereotypes. So the media, perpetuates stereotypes. You turn on any local news channel in Chicago any night of the week, and what are you going to see? You are going to see a black person's mugshot for some alleged crime, right? You rarely see the white person's mugshot for an alleged crime, and if you did, you probably wouldn't remember it anyways. Media perpetuates stereotypes about women. We could talk about this. There are fewer positive images of minorities in the media. So, for example, if you pick any, movie that has been shown in the last year, and you ask the question, were there Arabic or Indian actors or actresses in those movies, and what kind of role were they playing? You're going to find that the majority of the Arabic roles in movies and TV shows over the last year have probably gone probably those roles are terrorism-based bad guy roles, right? You never see, it's very infrequent that you see a movie or a TV show where the main character is a black woman and she's the hero of the movie, and the bad guy is the old white man. All right, now these things are changing, right? But there's definitely fewer positive images of minorities in the media writ large. Classic example. This is from Hurricane Katrina. I love this example, right? So these are two different images that ran Let's see. Oh, it doesn't have the date on it. I forget when the date was. Let's see. Oh, it doesn't have the date on there. So these are two different images from Hurricane Katrina that ran, let's just say, within a week of each other. Now notice the top image. A young man walks chest deep through floodwater after looting a local grocery store in New Orleans. Right? So that word looting implies negativity, right? It implies stealing, it implies badness, right? Now down here, basically the same thing. Two residents wading through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda at a local grocery store, right? So the black person is looting, but the white people are finding, right? And this is an example of this sort of like institutional level prejudice, right? The people who wrote these Associated Press releases, they weren't thinking about being prejudiced. They weren't being deliberate, right? But because people in the United States have these associations, these kinds of subtle wording, these kinds of subtle messaging take place. Now, how do we reduce stereotypes? Contact hypothesis is one way to reduce stereotypes. So having direct contact with an outgroup where you are of equal status, power differential can help to reduce prejudice. So for example, in the late 90s, I believe, there was a big push for this sort of for gay people to come out of the closet, because the idea is that if you know a gay person, you are less likely to be prejudiced towards them than if you don't know any gay people. Now, in order for the contact hypothesis to work, you have to be equal in the status. You have to have some direct interaction with the person. And ideally, you should be cooperating for some goal. So, for example, you can read about this in the book. The Robbers' Cave is a famous paper where they took boys at a camp and they separated them into two groups, and they generated these prejudice against each other, and then they had them work together, and by the end they were all friends. There's a lot more details about that. But it basically, like, they created conditions of prejudice and discrimination between groups, and then they ameliorated them through this contact hypothesis. So that is it for the prejudice and discrimination lecture. Make sure you watch the videos for this week's discussion. And as always, make sure you're taking the quizzes early and often. Same thing with discussion, posting early and often. And make sure you email me if you have any questions.